For notes 3, we are going to write the equations of altitudes and perpendicular bisectors. But remember, we first need to remember what an altitude is. And an altitude connects our vertex to the opposite side, and it needs to be perpendicular to that opposite side. So one of the things that we are going to need to do is we need to find that vertex coordinate from our picture. We will need to find the slope of the opposite side, because the slope, if it needs to be perpendicular, we need the slope of that opposite side, so then we can change our slope so we know the perpendicular slope. Then we will use the vertex coordinate and that perpendicular slope to write our equation, because then the vertex is the only coordinate we know that will be in our line. We are actually going to start down here on number 2, but it still gives us our steps. So at number 2, we need to find the slope of segment AB, because we are going to write the altitude from vertex C to this opposite side. So we need to know the slope of side AB so we can know what the perpendicular slope is that will connect it to point C. So first we need to find the slope of AB. Remember, the y's are on top, x's are on the bottom when we subtract. And if we go -5 minus 3 on top, then we have to put the -2 first and then our 0. We have -5 minus 3 is a -8. -2 minus 0 is -2, and when we reduce that, it gives us a 4. So our slope to begin with is 4, but now we need to find the perpendicular slope. On your notes right now, I want you to write what our perpendicular slope is. We need to make sure that they have opposite signs, and it will be reciprocals of each other. So take the time right now to write that on your paper. Since our original slope is a 4/1, we need to change that. So our perpendicular slope needs to be different signs, and our first one is a positive. So our perpendicular slope will be a negative. Then, when we have to write the reciprocal, we need to flip our fraction. So it was a 1 on the bottom, and now it's going to be a 1 on top, and our 4 on top will be on the bottom. So here's our perpendicular slope that we need to use for our equation. We need to use the perpendicular slope now of the segment opposite the vertex and the vertex coordinate to write our equation for point slope form. Since we already have our perpendicular slope of -1/4, we can write that in there. Then the only coordinate that we know is going to be on this line. We don't know where it's going to be crossing on AB, but we know that it has to go through our vertex. So we're going to use our vertex C of 6, -3, since that's what they told us, that altitude that we need to find. And now if we put those numbers in, we will have our y value first, and that becomes a +3. And then we have our x value last. Our slope still goes in front of our parentheses, so that'd be the -1/4. So there is our point slope form that we're going to use. Now I want you to practice rewriting it into slope intercept form. So first write out what your equation is, and then you are going to distribute and solve for y. When you distribute, you should get a -1/4 x for the first one, then plus 1/4, so a -1/4 times a -6/1. Remember, we can go straight across. That gives us a +6/4, which then if we reduce it becomes a +3/2. On the other side, then you solve a +3. When you subtract your 3, we end up with, there we go, a -1/4 x, and that will become a -1/2, which, or 1.5, which is -3/2. Onto the perpendicular bisector. We need to remember what a perpendicular bisector is. In the perpendicular part of it, we know that it will be a 90-degree angle or something perpendicular, but the bisector means that the segment is being cut in half, so that means it's going through the midpoint. So it connects the midpoint, and then it is 90 degrees through that midpoint. We are going to start with number 3, and we are going to write the equation of the perpendicular bisector of segment AB. So that means that it goes through the midpoint on segment AB, and it needs to be perpendicular to it. So it doesn't mean it has to go through point C this time, it just needs to be perpendicular to our side, but going through our midpoint. So we first need to find the midpoint coordinate, then we will need to find the slope of that side of the triangle. Then we can switch our slope to the perpendicular slope. Then we can use that midpoint and the perpendicular slope to write our equation of the line. So to begin with, we need to find what is the midpoint of that side. We need to add our x's together, so that would be -6 plus -2. We need to add our y's together, which is -4 plus 4. When we simplify that, we get a -8/2, and then a 0 over 2, which comes out at -4, 0. And if you paid attention, this picture is the same triangle that we have seen before, and we have actually found that midpoint before at -4, 0. Next, we need to find the slope of that same side. On this one, let's go ahead and practice counting it. So let's make a right triangle, and we need to count the spaces going up and over. So our rise, if we count how many spaces up it is from letter A, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 below, and we have 4 above, so that would be 8 for our rise, so 8 on top. And then we have 4 going across, so our run is 4, and that is a positive slope. So we're going to have a positive 2 for our regular slope. Next, we need to make the perpendicular slope. So remember, with our perpendicular slope, we need to change the sign. If our 2 is a positive, we know the perpendicular will be negative. We need to see it as a fraction, so it's 2 over 1. We need to write the reciprocal of that, so that would be a -1/2 for our slope that we're going to use for the perpendicular line, and that's the part that we do need. We now need to write the perpendicular slope along with the midpoint coordinate, because those are the only two things we know from our definition up here. It goes through the midpoint, and it has to be perpendicular to that side. So we need the perpendicular slope and our midpoint to write the equation of our perpendicular bisector. Our perpendicular slope then, remember, is -1/2. Our midpoint was the -4, 0. And now I want you to write your equation in point slope form for that equation. You should have put your 0 in for the y and the -4 for the x, which makes it a positive. Your slope was a -1/2. So that should be your equation for point slope form. Next, if we take that equation, this one is going to be pretty quick too, because there's that 0 in there. It's going to simplify things a little bit. We need to distribute, so we get a -1/2 x. Half of 4 is 2, but we have a negative times a positive, so that will be a negative. And the 0 again, remember, is just going to disappear, so we get y equals on the left side. That means our y-intercept is at -2, and our slope is still at our -1/2. If you look in your picture up above, since we do want to graph this, if we have our slope of -1/2, we need to graph a couple of these dots along there. So I'm starting at the midpoint, and we are counting our slope of -1/2. And if I connect those together, there is our perpendicular bisector.